So that being said, why are we here? What are we doing? What's our goal? Really, the focus of this conversation in this session is to explore and distinguish and find parallels between concepts of stress, trauma, and grief, making those be really connected to both us as humans and the role that we have, and then also professional experiences. How does this intersect with school communities, navigating like pandemic recovery, natural disaster recovery, all these things that are impacting our communities, as well as other crisis events, the loss of a student, violence in the school community, things like that. We're also going to be explicit about sociocultural trauma and the ways that race and societal oppressions impact stress, trauma, and grief, and also are in of themselves experiences that create stress, trauma, and grief. And ultimately, we want to look at the end as to how recovery and renewal really can extend into our systems and kind of what these things all mean at a high level. So, those are our goals and our aims for today. And what I really want to emphasize and highlight, and hold me to this, I hope that I do this throughout this session, is really attending to the fact that stress, trauma, grief, and crisis is not just a student experience. And I think a lot of times when we in school systems have professional learning or we have, reflecting on how to solve a problem, oftentimes we really only say, okay, what do we as the school, as the adults in the school, do to support the kids in the school? And the reality is, there's a great impact on students, yes, and we're here because we love young people and want to care for them. But educators hold that stress, trauma, grief, and crisis. Administrators, support staff hold that as well and deserve to be attended to and deserve to have their experience named and validated. And because systems are made up of people, we know that this matriculates into attitudes, the stories we tell about our contexts, and the policies that get put in place and the approaches that get put in place in school systems. And so, my hope today is to really toggle between kind of all of these roles and identities, both challenging us as individuals, but helping us also to reflect deeper in how this is surfacing across all levels of the system. And so, just a quick look at these. So, when we talk about a trauma informed school, these are kind of the 6 core guiding principles that SAMHSA uplifts as being a component of a trauma informed school. I'm just going to high level summarize these, and you're going to see them woven then throughout every other part of the conversation we have today. So, kind of put on that detective lens and be looking for these things throughout the rest of the day. So, the first trauma informed principle is social justice. And essentially, how I take this to mean in the shortest way possible is that we cannot be trauma informed if we are not racially just, if we are not centering equity and focusing on justice as a means to care and support for the young people in their systems and our colleagues and peers. And so really this is about identifying where are there injustices occurring, where is harm happening, and what does it look like to take intentional actions to counter those injustices. The next one is collaboration, peer support, and mutuality. And what this is all about is seeking out partnerships and connections that we can lean on each other. Relationships are healing, relationships are supportive, relationships help us see our stories and narratives processed differently. And so being able to think through how might we come together and build communities, build networks, build narratives that help us heal after we experience trauma. That's what that pillar is all about. The next one is safety and stability. And this one is really a complicated one to talk about because safety is very subjective. I often tell when I talk about safety as a trauma informed principle, I talk about my best friend and I. When we were kids, we would go to an amusement park, like a Six Flags type thing, right? And it was great because we had flexibility. Our parents knew we were in this like contained park, so they just kind of let us roam. And I was like, I want to go on the riskiest roller coaster I possibly can, right? I'm like, I want to like pop my hips up so like my butt's not even touching the ground when I go off the dip. I only want the lap belt. Like I loved that because I knew the mechanisms were in place. I would be safe in the ride because that's what was designed. My best friend was like, I don't want to go on the ride if it doesn't have the shoulder bars and like extra buckles and like enclosed because that's what she needed to feel safe. And we could function. The amusement park, the system as a whole existed with both things in place. But what each of us needed right, was relative and subjective. And that's what's kind of complicated about this principle, right? Is we want universal safety procedures, universal safety protocols, when oftentimes there isn't a universality to what makes people feel safe. So, really, what this comes down to is that stability piece. What does it look like to create predictability, to create awareness for what's coming and what's expected? And then, how do we think through safety through the lens of different people and attend to that physically, psychologically, socially, and emotionally? So, there's a lot of complicated layers that build up that principle. Then we talk about trustworthiness and transparency. Really, this is about reducing surprises. This is really about trauma is violating, and it creates a sense of unpredictability, the sense of like kind of a whoa, like almost like a gotcha. You weren't planning on this thing happening, right? And so when we continue to bring surprises and new initiatives without support and all of these things, that can lead to a rupture in trust. And so being a predictable person, being transparent about what's coming, what's happening, the why behind things that are in place, all of those are ways to honor the trustworthiness and transparency, trauma informed principle. The next one, empowerment, voice, and choice. So when I think about this principle, this really does have to do with what does it look like to equip individuals to take agency over their own healing and over their own growth. And so providing opportunities to get insights and feedback, giving people authentic choice, right, in a way that allows them to understand what the outcomes of those choices are and be able to actually have the agency to make them, even if that's maybe not what you would have picked for them, and creating patterns where that can happen over and over again so that the individuals we care about feel empowered. Right. I think we can all probably imagine an initiative that's come down on us, government funding, a new manager, something that happened that was done to us instead of, or for us instead of with us. And that's really what this principle is all about. Let's do things with the community, not to them or for them. And then this last principle, resilience, growth, and change, is really about the affirmation of the strengths that individuals bring to the table. Who are you? What value do you inherently bring? What value does your community inherently bring? And how do we honor and affirm that and look for ways that you naturally are thriving in the face of complexity? And how do we support you in that and come alongside you and actually looking for resilience in your community and supporting growth? And saying, hey, in light of this pain, in light of this hardship, who do we now get to become? And that's not a toxic, positive way of dismissing, like everything happens for a reason and everything's good. But it's saying, no, like there is now a new part of yourself because of this like deep internal shift that happened because of this experience. So, what does it look like for us to affirm that change, validate it, and support you in moving forward? Not moving on necessarily, right? But moving forward. So I want to have us do a brief connection conversation. I'm going to put you in really quick, really speedy breakout rooms, and yeah, keep dropping those principles in the chat. Thank you. Oh yeah, all of these, right, for sure are uh, really resonant with restorative justice. Absolutely. I want to have us engage in a brief dialogue with each other because we talked about all these principles, right? You're thinking about which ones are resonant or important to you. And like, I think sometimes seeing this language is like so exciting because it's like, yes, I care about social justice. And oh my gosh, I want to do things with people. And I want to create a sense of safety that is customized in a way to the needs of all people. And then we get into our systems and we get into our context and we're like, oh no, this is so hard. How do I do this? And so the invitation is I just want us to create some space to just name that tension and name two truths that are related to these trauma informed principles, but seem like utterly opposite of each other. And we're going to do that through an exercise called a Venn diagram. And this is really about recognizing these contradictions without trying to necessarily define the intersection and overlap yet. It's simply about stating these things are at odds with each other. They're both true. How do we then get to dream out of the middle? So I'm going to show you an example. This is from some work that was done by the creators of this exercise in schools, talking about racial equity efforts in schools. And the vent on the left talks about the tension of individual teacher effort, right, and implementing these things. And so the one says individual teacher effort alone can't remedy racial inequity, right? We need the system to be involved. Yet, without individual teacher effort, we can't actually do racial equity and eliminate inequality, right? Both those things are true. We need individual and we need systemic, and they're kind of at odds with each other sometimes. The next one, teachers need theories and abstract concepts to think about race and racism, but we also need specific practices, concrete ideas, and actions about race and racism. Both are true. And when we begin to explore the overlap and intersect of those two things, that's where beautiful solutions and opportunity might surface. But for now, we're just labeling that dichotomy. In the middle is going to be ideated in the future as you continue to think about implementation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to send you into some quick breakout rooms. And in those breakout rooms, you'll engage in this conversation. What feels affirming or celebratory about implementing those 6 principles that we just saw, the last one? And then what feels dichotomous or challenging in working towards implementing them? Thanks for your engagement in those breakouts. So what I want to do now is kind of toggle through some of the similarities and overlaps between stress, trauma, and grief. And all of these have to do with experiences essentially of overwhelm, right? It's this idea of our senses, both emotionally, mentally, and biologically, are experiencing pressure, are experiencing a sense of escalation, experiencing feelings that leave us sometimes feeling confused, discombobulated, dysregulated, and disconnected. And so I want to distinguish a little bit between each of these and also speak to some of the overlaps. And so this, I think, is a really helpful way to think about the concept of stress because there are actually really good types of stress. Like, I am absolutely a deadline motivated person. Nikki is my colleague on the call here, and she will absolutely tell you, like, I need a deadline. I need it to be concrete and clear in order for me to feel motivated to get it done. And oftentimes I do it right before the deadline. That's stressful, but that stress helps motivate me. I don't know if there's any former athletes on the call, current athletes on the call, right? But the energy and the emotion before the big game as you're getting ready to perform or compete, that's good quality stress that helps move us forward. And part of why it's good stress, it's a manageable amount of stress, is because the resources that we perceive that we have and things that we have access to help us be able to manage and navigate it. And so what we see here is when our perceived resources are really high, and this can be when we're encountering a good stressor or a more negative or challenging stressor. If our perceived resources exceed the perceived stressor or match the perceived stressor, that's something that can be a challenge that we can overcome. We can navigate that because the thing that's challenging or hard or complicated is met with the capacity that we have, the capacity our community has, or the tools that we have access to. On the flip side, when we experience a stressor, we have something that maybe feels more negative or complicated, and our perceived resources are far under our perceived stressor. That then begins to feel like a threat. We don't feel equipped or like we have the tools or skills to actually navigate and hold on to that stressor. And so then it becomes a threat and leads us potentially into crisis mode. It leads us to feeling dysregulated. Thinking about that across all spheres, right? For our students, I think about this time sometimes like with assessments, right? If a student has like their notes, they have resources, they're able to talk to friends to complete a task, those resources that they have feel higher, feel more like they can meet the task, and they may do better on the assessment. Whereas it's in a standardized test, it's in a format they're not used to, they can't access resources, they can't talk, or really teachers can't really even ask questions. Their resources feel really low. That stressor then is now amplified. It feels like a threat, and they may not navigate or perform as well as they maybe otherwise could as a student facing example, right? I think about this as colleagues and staff, right? Think about how under-resourced we are, budget constraints, time constraints, sometimes make things feel like an overwhelming threat because our resources are so low. And then same thing in the system. We're constantly under political attack in the school system, right? There's funding issues and challenges. So that can make even us as a system, instead of feeling like we have a manageable challenge, we have an overwhelming threat. Because there are times when, especially those of us who are in like community facing or support roles, we know that we're like, yo, I have piles of resources for you. Take them. But like if people can't perceive, they aren't aware that they're there, they're not accessible to them because of language barriers, transportation barriers, safety barriers, right? Like they may have, quote unquote, a ton of resources available to them, but they may not be actually accessible to them, which means they're actually not available, you know? And similarly with the word perceived stressor, I think about this a lot in how I saw different students navigate divorce in their family, right? I had a student who had a really solid support network. There was a lot of tension in the home, and they were just like, I'm ready for my parents to be split. Like, I'm done with this. So, when their parents got divorced, that was a manageable challenge for them. They're like, I saw this coming. I've got the support system I need in place. I'm thriving. I'm fine. I adapted well. Then I had another student who was completely blindsided by his parents' divorce. He like did not see it coming. None of his friends in his friend group had divorced parents, so he didn't really know who to talk to or how to talk to it. He wasn't a kid who'd really ever interacted with like student support services or counseling before. So he just felt completely isolated. His attendance tanked, his grades tanked. Like he just really struggled with that threat, and that became a threat to him. So even the stressor based off of our experiences with it and the resources we have sometimes may land differently depending on the need. And when we talk about stress, repeatedly living in that threat category, when we constantly feel like we don't have resources, that chronic stress, that toxic stress can lead to an experience of trauma in our bodies. And that can be how that feels. And when we talk about trauma, I'm pulling this definition from Dr. Vander Kolk, Dan Siegel, Sandra Bloom, Bruce Perry uses this as well. And we talk about it through the lens of the three E's. So trauma is an event, an experience, and an effect. And so the event is like the big thing, right? And much like we talked about perceived resources or perceived stressors, trauma can be something that is felt proximally to a similar community to us somewhere else in another location, or something that we actively experience. And I think about naming this, especially in school systems, is really important because, like, I think a lot about the narrative and culture with like the massive increase we've seen in violence in schools and how when we read about it in current events, like our bodies have a reaction to it, right? We have a visceral response. And talking to survivors of gun violence in the school system, who then, when they see that current event happen again, their body responds and goes back to the place again, feeling the dysregulation, the fear, the anxiety, the stressor, right? And so, even sometimes if we're not actively experiencing the trauma, there is still an effect that is had on us if the event is something we're witnessing, or compassion fatigue or vicarious trauma, when people we care about are experiencing traumatic events, that almost in some ways feels like we and ourselves are in a trauma event. And so, again, actual danger or extreme threat of harm to ourselves or proximally as us as witnesses is what we call the event. Then the experience is what happens to us in light of that event. And I'm going to expound on this a little bit more in a few slides. We talk about the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response. And fawn is some new research coming out talking about more the acquiescence or the submitting to others' needs instead of honoring our own survival safety needs because we perceive that will keep us safer. That really is a helplessness feeling that leads to an overwhelm of our brain and body senses. Our thinking logic brain is completely offline. We're thinking from our survival brain. Our body's amped, ready to run, ready to fight, ready to hide. And we're not able to engage with the world and people around us in the same way. The effect of that over time, there's a disintegration. Our stress arousal system is acting overtime, which can lead to chronic illnesses if it's continually heightened. And that sense of dysregulation makes it harder for us to function in ways that we might otherwise. And much like the idea that stressors, right, is perceived, traumatic experiences can also be perceived differently. And an analogy for this is there's a film that came out a few years ago called Paper Tigers. I don't know if anybody's familiar with it, but it was about an alternative high school in Walla Walla, Washington. And it talked about how this experience or sensation, when young people or adults or systems have experienced something that's very traumatic, other threats that may not be traumatic, that may not actually be trauma, can activate that reactive trauma experience, activate that fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response. And so they use the analogy of a real tiger versus a paper tiger, how sometimes the brains and bodies of young people can't tell the difference because they're so used to being in that heightened survival state. So that's something we have to consider when we think about our own reactions to big events, when we think about young people's reactions to big events, and when we think about how the system as a whole responds to these things. And lastly, I want to touch on grief and this concept of grief. And grief is really not, grief is a newer like research avenue, even for me. I think it was something you just like, you talked about. It's like, oh, you're sad. Okay. And you'll get over it eventually. Like, I feel like that was the most grief education I ever had in like my teacher prep program, right? And really grief, the idea of grief stems out of a sense of loss. And we know that loss is relative, it's complex, but it's not only related to the death of a meaningful person. I think about the pandemic revealed a lot of loss to us, right? We had a lot of routines and rituals and habits that completely shifted. Relationships were impacted, even if they didn't pass away. There was a shift in relationship that happened. That's a loss, and there's grief there. Life transitions, even good ones. Like when I moved from the Midwest out to the Bay Area, I was like so excited to where I was like, I've always wanted to live on the West Coast. I'm 40 minutes from an ocean. I'm so excited. It was a good transition. There was a lot of grief mixed in there as well because I was leaving friends, things that were familiar. I wasn't living near family anymore. And our own perceptions and feelings around those things impact and compound how we navigate. And I also want to uplift the idea that not all grief involves trauma, right? But all trauma involves some level or layer of grief. And really, the most powerful remedy for grief is the sitting with. It's the patience, it's the long withstanding presence of someone who's a supportive and caring individual, right? Thinking back to that collaboration, peer support, mutuality principle, right? Sometimes it is just about the sitting with an individual. But I love this quote from Mary Frances O'Connor, a researcher in grief, that toggling between the idea of grief and grieving. So grief is an intensity, it's a momentary experience when you're navigating this loss. But grieving is an ongoing process, right? Holidays, critical events, things will bring up those feelings again in ourselves. They'll bring up our young feelings in our young people. And being able to sit with that and endure that and honor that is an important way to mitigate and remedy the impacts of grief in our school system. And all that to say, again, that's a very high level look at stress, trauma, and grief. So, but really, the invitation for us is when we're navigating those interpersonal relationships, the complexity of what it means to be a human, we're able to shift our perspective. And so, oftentimes, when we jut up against people's trauma responses, when people are stressed, when they're grieving, behaviors and interactions feel off. They feel different. They feel harder to navigate. And our default brain status as humans, especially when we're stressed, is to often be like, what's wrong with this person? We ask that of ourselves. We ask that of what's wrong with the school system, right? What's wrong with my colleague down the hall? What's wrong with this kid, this family, this community? We do that by default in different ways. And the invitation for us is to approach that with compassionate curiosity, to shift away from that, trying to judge and define and diagnose what's happening for the young person, to be curious about, okay, what might be happening here? What is this behavior or this action or reaction communicating? And is there a need that is yet unmet that either I can meet or find perhaps someone else might meet? And to do that with students, ourselves, our colleagues, and the system as a whole. This is a big critical shift. And so I know there's a lot of text on the slide, and I apologize. You will be able to access a copy of the slide deck too. I don't know that I said that beginning. But these are kind of some of the reactions and responses that happen when our survival brain takes over. So when we're experiencing extreme stressors, we're experiencing trauma, or maybe we're navigating the weightiness of grief. These might be reactions that either we experience or our young people experience. A system can toggle and play with these things as well. So the fight response, oftentimes in a school system, we may label this young person as a bully. We may call them non-compliant. It might show up like someone who's a verbally, right, confronting someone, always has something to say. They might throw objects. They might demonstrate physical aggression. They're going to feel unpredictable, perhaps reactive. And a lot of times when we see this as, oh my gosh, the student is being non-compliant, right? That's a judgment. That's a what's wrong with kind of thinking. And the invitation for us to say is, whoa, like if I'm seeing these behaviors, what might be underneath that fight response? Why might they feel the need to fight? What might be activating that survival status in them in order to like navigate the situation more effectively? And an invitation for this too, like, we don't always need to know every trauma that every individual's experienced. In fact, I would encourage us to not ask that. Don't explore that. But consider, if this might be trauma, how might I respond with compassionate curiosity instead of trying to seek out compliance? What might that look like? Because these practices, holding a trauma informed lens, whether it's trauma or not, is good practice, right? But if we think about it the other way and like, well, I need to know if this is you're experiencing trauma before I respond to you, that's not going to lead us towards much success. The next response, trauma response, survival response, is flight. Um, and this one's interesting because some of these elements are actually validated in the school system and some of them might actually not be. So flight is really more about avoiding, right? And same with freeze, it's kind of about avoiding. And so the flight response might show up like our elopers, kiddos who are always not where they're supposed to be, running out of class, someone who's always moving, busy, avoiding downtime. But this also surfaces like perfectionism, obsession over a topic or a performance because they're trying to escape the reality of that pain, that trauma. So they're distracting themselves and escaping from thinking about that with overachieving, with success. And so reflecting around, if I'm seeing those behaviors, what might it look like to attend to that differently? And we have our freeze response. Sometimes the school system might label these young people as someone who's disengaged or a dropout. This oftentimes I see surface a lot with grief. There's a numbness that can sometimes show up if students aren't really sat with and have a presence of a supportive adult near them. So this is passive refusal, their head down. They might just binge on media, just kind of passively tuning the world out around them. This may also look like young people who are sometimes just confused, like unaware of what's going on because they're just not engaging with the information that's coming in because their brain is focused in survival. It's not focused on that thinking part of their brain. And then the last one, this is a newer emerging response that research has been revealing recently, is the fawn response. And this looks like people pleasing. This looks like acquiescing or appeasing whatever the demand is, listening and responding to whatever that stressor is demanding of them so that they feel like they can survive. This is a young person or an adult. This was me as a teacher, right? Cave into peer pressure. I'm always saying like yes to every initiative that comes my way and every ask because I'm like, well, I'll just take care of it. I'll just handle it. I might be hyper aware of the mood of others. Ask a lot of what questions so they know what to do to make sure everybody's happy and feels safe and appeased around them. And what's interesting is we might not actually view this as a trauma response. Like oftentimes this is what we're trying to push other students to, right? This is what we're trying to get other kids to do. When the reality is this may actually be a way that the student is trying to escape from some of the trauma that they're experiencing. And so it's an interesting reflection point to think about, again, like I said, how these things may not be, right, necessarily always rooted in trauma, but when we hold the lens that there's a possibility that the way we see our young people behaving may be related to this, the way our colleagues may be behaving, right? Think about someone who's always combative in staff meetings, someone who's always checked out in staff meetings, someone who's always the yes man and does whatever admin wants, right? This shows up in us too, is an important reflection point. And knowing the ones that affect us and how we react is actually really helpful in thinking about how we respond to young people. For me, I was, like I said, a fawner or a fighter. I had a really hard time engaging with students who shut down. I didn't understand that trauma response. So I didn't know how to really hold the students who were frozen in a way because I was like, let's handle the combating. I know how to verbally confront. I know how to navigate that because I've experienced it. And so being cognizant of our own responses is really helpful. So we know maybe what might get under our skin. And so holding that tension is really important of saying, if I'm seeing behaviors that are like harmful to me, harmful to the young person, what does it look like to be curious about that and try to discern what might be happening underneath? And I know about the cultural nuances that surface in this and how we're allowed to grieve differently. I think about having attended funerals of students from different cultural backgrounds. So what grief has looked like in those spaces has been wildly different. And that's beautiful. But also, how do we toggle that when we're looking for a universal policy? We really can't, right? There's not really a universal approach. So it's holding that curiosity for sure. Building off of that, again, like these are ways that survival brains manifest. there are also young people who demonstrate these behaviors who are not in survival brain, right? Like there are choices to people please. There are sometimes choices to engage in a conflict. So these aren't always rooted in trauma. But I do think it's so, to your point of the different access to resources and the different way that who we affirm to for being fawn behaviors, who we affirm, who gets the benefit of the doubt in a fight type response versus who doesn't. Those are all really important things to hold when we think about specifically the school system that historically has not honored all kids the same way, right? So we talk about the reality of our universe, right? The reality of the world that we live in, and specifically within the context of school systems. Like the things that happen to our young people aren't happening in a bubble. They're not happening in a vacuum. We live in a world that has racism, sexism, classism, homophobia, all of these things. And that impacts access to resources. That impacts the ways in which they're able to navigate those traumas, the ways that they're supported and validated in our school systems or not supported and validated in our school systems. And on top of it, experiencing xenophobia, ableism, sexism, racism, classism, homophobia, like those are also traumas. Those things are also stressful and traumatic and involve grief. So it's really an overlaying of experiences on top of that. So when we're seeing, right, these like fawn responses, we're seeing fight responses. Those things are both simultaneously exacerbated and launched by some of the societal pressures that our young people experience and face. And so holding that lens always when we talk about trauma-informed practices, we talk about racial equity and social justice, we have to hold both of them in our frame of mind. Because if we're not thinking about racism and anti-racism through a trauma-informed lens, we're missing the trauma that racism caused, and we're missing how that impacts people's access to resources to heal, right? And the supports that are available to them. So it's important to name that and hold that as we hold this conversation. And so I want to give you space to talk. I've been talking at you a lot. I've dumped a ton of information on you, but I believe in the power of mutual equipping, right? I'm not positioning myself here as an expert. I'm here to share insights with y'all and then let you think about how to contextualize it and what this means for your work. Reflecting on your context, what you see happening in our school systems with young people, with colleagues, with yourself. We know that some traumas and responses are socially validated, others aren't. I'll invite you to just dialogue around these three questions. But again, wherever the conversation goes, take it there. In the face of a crisis, what do you see, hear, and feel in students, colleagues, and yourself that aligns with these trauma responses? Which experiences draw up greater empathy and which experiences are more challenging for you to understand? Again, holding the racial equity, the different isms, as well as the different responses, how you respond, how that might jut up against or butt up against the way young people in your life are responding. And then simply, how does this learning compel us differently? What is this content shifting in you? What wonderings is it bringing up? What challenges is it bringing up? So really anywhere you want to take this conversation, free to do that. Right. Awesome. I'll keep us moving because I really want to now kind of keep building on these themes and really intersect it with how we talk about crisis and we think through recovery and renewal specifically beyond just readiness and response. And that's really what this grant project is all about. That's really why we show up in these spaces and have these conversations, because we know that our school systems are really crisis impacted, right? And I think a lot about crises. I don't remember if I added a slide for this, but I'll talk kind of about these two here. So when we think about kind of the 4 Rs, the readiness is the in-between crisis, which when I say that, I'm probably most of you are like, what's that? Like there's time in between, we're not in crisis. What does that mean? Right. But it's this idea of like, we've kind of time has passed, right, since the crisis. And we may, you may argue like thinking about things from wildfires, the pandemic, maybe right now, because we're not actively combating COVID in the same way in our school system. We're in a readiness season for a future pandemic response, not to, trigger that, like, oh, I don't want to think about that. But like when we are not actively responding or reacting to a crisis, what systems level reflections, policies, trainings, practices are we putting into place? And so that may be, right, training like this that happens at a staff every year, that they're getting oriented or awareness of these concepts. How do we communicate with families? What messaging is going out? How are we sharing, hey, in the event of, we have practice fire drills, we practice, also say tornado drills, but that's only for, my Midwest folks on the call. My West Coast people are like, tornado. How do we prep and get ready for an eventual crisis? And then we talk about response. And this is, I think, where most school systems live and where most school systems stop, right? Is what is our immediate response to an event that we would call a crisis that exceeds our threshold of harm? So, how are we initially stabilizing? How are we making sure? When I was teaching, we had two 100-year or two 500-year floods in like a 6-year period. It was really fun, right? Like we barely got up on our feet again after the last one. And then we had this another major natural disaster. 40% of my students were homeless because of this natural disaster. So, like, what are we doing immediately to get kids food, get them shelter, those immediate reactions, what initial communication is going out, right? Once we get that sense of stabilization again, that's kind of the conclusion of the response phase. And okay, I didn't put the slide in here, but I want to make sure I name when we talk about crises, right, in the school system, I want us to hold a bit of a both and thinking here because we talk a lot about major crises, right? School violence, natural disasters, those types of things, loss of a student. Those are crises we have to navigate the school system, community violence. Those impact the larger community. I would call that a macro crisis, right? This is a larger impact. We also day to day know that we navigate micro crises, right? Where students or adults are experiencing crisis like symptoms or they're being impacted by something that maybe is a smaller network of people. I think about like a fight in the hallway, right? A fight breaks out between passing periods, right? The people witnessing that, the teachers intervening, and the students involved are experiencing a crisis. But it's not a massive crisis in the sense that it impacts a whole school community per se. So, kind of holding some of that both and as we think about kind of these responses in the next steps. So, when we are kind of done with that response phase, when we've moved out of that initial stabilization, it's important for us to think about okay, what might it then look like to begin making sense of this and start moving towards like healing, restoration, or what we call recovery and renewal. So, some questions to ask ourselves: how activated are our nervous systems, right? If I walk past this environment, am I still agitated? Do I feel nauseous when I pull up to the school building? Am I feeling really anxious when I see a certain student come in my classroom? Like, that's an activated state. I may still be responding to that crisis. I may not have actually found the safety that I need to keep moving forward. Question 2, are we still attending to immediate safety needs? Are we capable of reflection and actually getting meta and stepping outside of the experience, or are we still too much in the trenches of it? How safe do I feel? Are my physical, emotional, social, psychological needs being addressed in response to that crisis, or am I still navigating those things? How connected do I feel to people around me? What is my sense of trust? And then what is the narrative? What kind of story are we telling ourselves about what happened? What are we communicating to others? And so thinking about specifically kind of those first 4, if we're able to be like, no, I'm feeling a bit more regulated, I'm able to step outside of the experience, my safety needs are met, and I'm beginning to reflect, we may be able to move towards the recovery and renewal. Otherwise, we may still be lingering in that response phase. Excuse me, I have the hiccups. So when we see recovery, we talk about there's 3 really observable phases in the recovery process. And it's really about attuning and honing in on safety and stabilization in deeper ways than just immediate needs. It's about actually engaging in a process of remembrance and mourning and beginning to say, okay, what did happen and how do we talk about it? And then moving towards reconnection and engagement and social action in light of what we experienced. And as I talked about briefly, you'll notice again the intersection with these trauma informed principles, right? When we talk about safety and stabilization, yes, this is physical safety, right? Do we have homes, shelter, food, resources? How do we also think about emotional safety, social safety, predictability? We have spots built in our school communities where students feel like they can talk about their experiences, to have trusting relationships with adults in the building. What is the peer to peer culture like? And are student groups really isolated from each other? Are we able to pull them together to connect and build relationships? What also might predictability look like, right? I talked about the idea of trauma and crisis. It violates our sense of stability. It's really jarring, it's unsettling. So, what does it look like for us to collectively begin to recreate a sense of routine, predictability again, relating to the environment, transitions, the physical setting of things? What levers can we play with in order to design that? Does that look like budgeting? Does that look like the schedule? Does that look like the physical space? How might we consider what it might feel like for young people to feel safer and more stable? And that kind of intersects too with each of these strategies. So we talk about like evidence-based programs that are supporting our young people. That kind of funnels into like coping mechanisms. How are they regulating themselves? How are we regulating ourselves when we feel stressed, we feel pressure? When we think about the loss of power that we felt in that crisis, what does it look like for us to find opportunities to regain that sense of power? Where can we find, again, those principles overlapping, right? Collaboration. Where can we find agency, restore voice and choice in the system again? And I think we can do this even through academics, right? Like having a choice. Do you want to write your response or do you want to record an audio of your response? Even little choices like that can help our young people have more agency and autonomy, which creates some safety and stabilization for them. Supporting young people and adults, like was pointed out earlier, right? How do we metabolize our emotions? How do we help people around us? Like Christine named, right? Like you think this isn't impacting you, it is. So, how do we name that? What tools are available? What spaces might we create to help you do that? Which really gets into self-awareness and self-attunement, right? I think especially as adults, we're so used to what's happening for my young people. How am I navigating their reactions and their emotions instead of also being like, yo, how am I feeling? How am I being impacted? What does it look like to be aware of myself, which ultimately has roots in just knowing and being known, right? Building those relationships and connections that helps us feel more safe and stable and held in environments even after a crisis. Building on that, step two is this idea of remembrance and mourning. And this isn't necessarily yet about having something that's really defined and concrete. What this is really about is creating space. And I love this definition of holding space, where it talks about offering the experience of being heard without fixing, solving, or treating. And that's hard, right? Because especially as educators or education minded people, I want to teach, I want a solution, I want to equip you, which is a beautiful desire. But after crisis, when we're holding both stress and grief and walking through trauma, being able to create space to just be, connect, share stories, memories, be validated in your experience is really empowering and really healing. And being able to make spaces that are different. Like I mentioned earlier, as much as I hate to have had this experience, I've attended funerals of students from different cultural backgrounds, right? And the way in which their families and communities grieved was different and it looked different. And so, what might it look like to honor that within a school system? What might it look like to create spaces for young people who were really close to maybe a person who was lost, and then have space for others to kind of make sense of it who maybe weren't quite as close to that individual? Or how do we create spaces for quiet grief and the sitting with, and then spaces for loud grief and the vocal and verbal processing that sometimes comes? So holding in a way a differentiated support for staff, for students, for various needs is really important when we think about creating spaces in our school systems for remembrance and mourning. And then lastly, and this is kind of the bridge then into this idea of renewal, this sense of reconnection. And there's two ways we see reconnection surfacing when we talk about recovery. One has to do with the reconnection with self. It's about saying, I am not defined by this trauma. There are things, however, I've learned about myself, things that have been revealed to me through this. So it's a wondering of how am I shifting my identity? How am I changing into a different person because of this? And then how am I re-engaging and reconnecting with community? Who am I becoming in light of this, and what community have I found? And I think a lot about we see this organically happen, natural disasters, right? Community members come together, they'll organize efforts and they'll pull together resources and try to go through their neighborhoods to make sure their neighbors have everything, right? That's a process that happens and bridges us then into this sense of renewal. And so just really quickly, I'm curious if there's any reactions to this. I want to be cognizant of time too, and I want to move us along as well. But when you think about safety, stability, we think about recovery. I'm curious which of these you've seen surface in your experience, and which one of these maybe feels like, oh, I haven't really touched this, or we don't really see this happening in our community. So between like safety, remembrance, and mourning, and then that idea of social action and reconnecting with self. So then bridging towards this idea of renewal. So we at the SCRR project have kind of thought through different pillars or different ways that renewal shows up and surfaces. And we also know that when we talk about things like stress, trauma, grief, navigating a crisis, we like to visualize these things linearly because that's just a logical way to frame a presentation. But the reality is, these things don't necessarily happen in a certain order. And as we bridge into this healing and meaning making and making change, really each of these components focus on how do we begin to build a tighter, more succinct, more clear narrative around who our community is and what this experience was for us. And I think oftentimes senior leadership and the media get to tell the story before we as a community who's impacted by it really gets to begin to define that, because we're still oftentimes in response mode when everyone else is like, hey, here's what's happening in this community, right? Thinking about like what's happening in with the wildfires in Maui right now. Many of us have an understanding of a narrative that's been going on because of what's been shared by people who aren't actually there experiencing it, right? A lot of it's just what is the national media talking about? And so when we think about renewal and beginning to move towards healing, this really is about what is the story and narrative that the community impacted is beginning to tell. There's a couple ways we begin to see the surface when we think about renewal. First is the idea of creating structural witnessing. What does it look like to sit together, be together, kind of like that idea of uh like the witnessing, or the what was the thing I said earlier? Now my brain is shutting down. This idea of how do we sit together and not focus on fixing or trying to find solutions, but just being together, bridging off of that idea, building structures and spaces for us to understand and affirm and validate what the experience has been, holding on to those significant relationships, both saying, hey, I want to lean on you for support, but also naming and noticing like who is a big network person for you. And I think like when we had a really intense event at a school I was at, we within the 8th grade team built some space for us to have conversations with our students. What we did is we said, hey, like we have other support staff who's going to be out in the hallway, to make sure we're not losing any of our duckies. And we'll say, hey, we're going to have a conversation. We're going to sit together. We're going to do a circle, right? My restorative justice folks, right? We're going to do like a restorative circle type protocol. And we're going to give you autonomy to go to the teacher's room that feels most comfortable for you to have this conversation. So we didn't keep it in the homeroom. We're like, where do you want to go? Right. And it was interesting because each teacher had an equal amount of students in there, which was really cool that they noticed, hey, this relationship is significant to me. I want to go to this person to have this dialogue, and creating space to allow that to happen. Right. That's also part of that collective reflection, sitting together and saying, what have you experienced? What have I experienced? What have we collectively experienced? And how does that begin to shape storytelling that we're doing? What is the narrative that's coming out of this? How am I choosing to tell this story? How are we choosing to tell the story? How does that influence the way the community is receiving this story? We also note that sometimes there's more questions than answers. We think about renewal and we think about looking back and reflecting. Sometimes that may surface more wonderings, more gaps in our policy that have failed certain groups of students. We may notice ways in which the structures of our system have not been honoring certain voices or have been neglecting certain stories. And naming those things and being willing to say, hey, I caused harm here. I want to go back and repair. Or, wow, this collective policy and approach did not work for this demographic of student. What do we need to do differently in the event that this happens again? Right? Like, how do we navigate this and be really reflective around the impact of our own actions and decisions as a system, not leaning into the defensiveness we may naturally feel, but be compassionately curious to explore, okay, what shifts might we need to make on a larger scale to better our students and ourselves and our community? And oftentimes we see as well a renewed commitment to the work after this crisis, right? I mean, I would be willing to bet that many of us on the call are in the work that we are in because of an experience we had as a young person, or because of an influential individual in our lives, or something that was really significant that caused us to feel a sense of care and connection to the work that we're in. That's the case with most educators, right? And so I think when we experience these things, we experience crises, we experience traumas, sometimes what that does for us is pushes us towards saying, hey, in my healing, in my growth, in the resilience that I felt out of what I experienced, I want to continue to be better. I want to do better. I want to reinvest in this community because I was reminded how much I care for them. And that's an important reflection point as well. And I'll share out as well. We have a lot of resources that go really in depth into each of these components when we talk about renewal. Um, and so there's resources and things I can share out with you to continue this conversation. But I want to hone in a bit more specifically on the concept of healing, including some distinguishing questions that can help us process and toggle how are we navigating these domains and components of healing, and what might we need to think critically about in order to keep moving our communities towards healing. And so the first thing is root cause focus. And so when we think about a lot of the current events that are happening and things that are going on in our world right now, like oftentimes we're so responsive to the fruit, right? We're seeing the flowers or the symptoms or the reactions, and we're not actually understanding what's happening, the core of the issue. And so we just keep dealing with the bad apples, to use an overly used phrase. And instead of saying, oh, what's actually happening that's making these apples not produce like we want them to, right? And so being reflective around what underlying issues impacted the crisis. What ways might holistic supports address that root cause? Where are some spots that we need to be humble and reflective in a deeper way in order to really identify the issue that we can attend to? When we talk about the idea of meaning making and the narrative that's told, who is the one getting to shape that narrative? Whose voice is being prioritized? Whose stories are being centered and uplifted? Why? And even more importantly, I think, what outcomes do we see from the stories being told? Right? Is this leading to growth and community? Are the stories and the narratives leading to division and judgment? I think so often, right? You always have that school in the district, right? I shifted from one school to another, and I remember there's a school that was impacted by crisis after crisis. A lot of the students came from trauma in their childhood and their growing up experience. The way the community talked about that school was really painful and really hard. Right. And so that outcome was staff didn't want to go there. Parents were afraid to send their kids there. When the truth is, it was one of the most powerful and rich school communities I've ever worked in. The narrative, right, was leading to these outcomes that weren't even accurate. So really thinking about who gets to define that storytelling, what outcomes come. The next component relating to these things has to do with restoration and identity shifts. Really the question, in light of what we've learned about ourselves, what we've learned about our organizations, how are we beginning to redefine ourselves? How are we re-engaging with the community around us? What might that look like? And how does that need to look the same? What strengths are we now uplifting and celebrating? And also, what shifts need to be made? What weaknesses or challenges were revealed that we need to address and attend to? And that deeper question, too, what does it look like to move forward without moving on? Right? We're not simply shutting down, and never addressing this crisis or this conversation again. Right? Being reflective around how might we continue to build community, connect with each other, connect with the people immediately around us in the larger community in new ways. And the last piece of healing, again, is related to that root cause focus, is repairing. Where might harm have been caused during our response, during the recovery phase? How might we make it right? And then also being attentive to, how do people define healing as individuals, right? We're not looking for a universal one size fits all solution. So how might we create a collective acknowledgement or affirmation of the healing and the natural resilience that occurs in communities, right? Especially I think in marginalized communities, most often we neglect the natural strengths, abilities, connection, culture that exists. That's actually really healing for a lot of our students. And we just seek to try to shift and shuffle, and you're going to do it in the way that I think this should look, instead of affirming, no, what's actually happening in your community with your family that is powerful and beautiful, that isn't often validated or acknowledged in the school community typically. So again, a lot of pockets of information kind of tossed your way. And I'm curious, thinking about kind of those four things: root cause, meaning making, identity shifts, and repairing harm. Feel free to drop in the chat or come off mute. Which of these is feeling really resonant for you in the work, the space that you're in your work right now, and why? So feel free to drop that in the chat or come off mute. Which of these is feeling really aligned or resonant with your work and why? So I want to set this up, but I'm going to give you, as a good teacher does, some homework. What I'm going to do, and I'm not going to give you this now because I want to like have some separation between like all of this information and give you some time to digest and synthesize. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna share out a tool with you. It's a Word document, a grid similar to this on that document. And really the invitation is for us to think about, in light of all this information, we can reflect and have the opportunity to reflect on practices in a range of domains. So I have the ability to think about, okay, when I think about myself as a human, as a practitioner, how might I make shifts to my practice based off of this conversation today? But again, it's not just about us, it's also about the context we're in. So from a classroom lens, or maybe for you, it's a team lens, or someone who has like a job alike lens, or maybe a more immediate department. What shifts do you want to make to that collective practice? And then thinking about the larger system, what shifts need to be made in that larger system? And when I talk about shifts, I'm thinking through it in a couple ways. The first being stop. What are practices, habits that aren't moving us towards healing, that aren't moving us towards recovery, renewal, trauma-informed practices that we just got to stop, just got to name it, right? What are some things that we're already doing that align with these concepts that we want to sustain, that we want to keep doing, that are good and are working for our young people and ourselves? And then what's something perhaps new that we might want to start? An example of how this might look when we think about different ways that we can implement some of these things. You may not have something for all of them, or you may immediately be like, oh my gosh, yes, I have like 12 things for each of them as you're thinking and reflecting. It's just a way to kind of structure and help you process different ways to implement and engage in some of these practices. So that resource will be shared out with you, as well as a PDF of the slide deck and some other materials